Disruptors and curious minds, welcome to another episode of Thinking on Paper. My name is Jeremy Gilbertson, builder and futurist at the intersection of music, tech, and story. With me, as always, is my partner on the other side, Mr. Mark Fielding. How are you, Mark? What's happening?
I am excellent. Very excited about today's show because I think one of our goals of Thinking on Paper is to kind of guide people and help people as we learn about emerging technologies. And I think today's guest and the conversation we're going to have is going to literally bring everything we've ever said into one coherent framework and one coherent conversation. It's going to be fantastic.
I couldn't agree more, Mark. I'm always excited about our guests because they're brilliant people. They've accomplished amazing things and they're great communicators and among other things. But our guest today has put out a book that I think almost brings together this self-directed exploration that I've personally been on to kind of figure out the world, and to see it kind of locked into a book so concretely, and ideas so connected to point ourselves as a society towards the big challenges and the big problems, and the effort of opening people's eyes up to the interconnected nature of all of these systems and understanding how the systems work and the creative mind works and the ability to execute. I'm doing mental backflips right now. So excited. But
I don't know how you approach the research for this, but one of the things when I was reading about the Nexus and reading about the work, one of the things that struck me was how applicable it was to me as a writer, the things that he talks about. And I know that he's the way that it works for me, just mentioning a couple of the ideas. So our thinking space is expand when we learn how others think, learn the craft and then set it aside, learn how to adapt and to thrive with constraints, do not converge too quickly, step back and look at the entire picture. And on it goes. And these insights, they work for me as a writer. They work for you as a music producer. They work for anybody who's a leader, who's in a marketing department, a PR department. Like having this ability to create a framework from other people's thoughts is priceless. So yeah, let's get into it.
I agree. Awesome. Well, thanks again to our amazing sponsor, Ripple with a WRIPPLE. Marketing's on-demand talent platform. These guys are great in providing access to brilliant freelancers like Mark Fielding and I, among 3,000 plus others. If you have a project that you need to flex out and pull a team together, whether it's building a website, whether it's creating some copy or a video or even strategy, they are amazing. I know we're getting into fourth quarter. There's probably some last minute things getting dropped in your lap. Folks at Equifax, Delta, who are the other ones? Coca-Cola, among others. Trust these guys. So check them out. Our friend Dixie's usually in the chat thread, and like to definitely thank them very much for their support of our show. With that, let's get right in. I don't want to hear us talking. I want to bring in our wonderful guest. You want to introduce him really quick, Mark?
Yeah, I will. I'll try to be quick. So yeah, this week's guest is Giulio Attino, thought leader, scientist, author, and former Dean of Engineering and Applied Science at Northwestern University. Now, get this. He was the co-founder and director of the Northwestern Institute on Complex Systems. He's a fellow of the American Physical Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's in the 100 Engineers of the Modern Era, created by the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow. He's a member of both the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Sciences, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Science. His research work is centered on chaos theory, and his book, Nexus, is available where all good books are sold. Welcome, Giulio.
I'm so glad to be here, Jeremy and Mark. You too, with the comments you made, you come close to my ideal readers. One hard thing in writing the book appealing to so many audiences, I talk with people in neuroscience and architects and physicists and mathematicians and historians and art historians, is that it's very hard to set a level in which every one of those possible readers will be happy with what you're saying. Many of them would like to see more. Many of them would like to see things in more depth. And that was really hard. The other thing that was hard is the deal was the book will have 360 pages. 200 color images. And the question is, we could go down in the color images, put more text. The text, we could squeeze more, and I think we push this as much as we could with the font size, but it's very tightly integrated. But the whole thing is images and text should hit you at the same time, and you should be able to go more deeply into anything that you want. But the points that you extracted are music to my ears, are all things that I wanted readers to get.
Amazing. One question I have as we're starting this thing, so you're talking about being in between all of these disciplines, or you call them domains in the book. So like neuroscientist, physicist, say psychologist, maybe musician, maybe artist or whatever. So how do you land on the initial universal language to kick everything off and tie things together?
Boy, so for a long while, I had this sort of dual existence of being in love with math, because when I was growing up, especially high school, college, Argentina was extremely chaotic. This was a time in which people vanished, they disappeared, and the purity of math just been this platonic thing out there, almost immutable. And you could see vestiges of this. I was fascinated by Borges, but I was also fascinated by Kafka, and my paintings at that point were anything but happy paintings. So, but I had this duality of art and science, and eventually I had to pick something to go in, and I went into engineering. I was putting them in more boxes, but after a while, I realized that thinking like an artist and being more able to think visually was really a huge advantage in anything connected with math. People think that math is about rational thinking. No, math is about intuition. The best mathematicians are the ones who have the best hunches. You imagine something, the Platonist among the mathematicians will say you discovered that something was always there. And then you try to prove that your hunch was correct. So the thinking that it's in art, more holistic, broader if you want, more divergent, even metaphorical, that carries to things that most people who are not into these kinds of things will think that they're worlds apart, but they're really, really, really connected. And once in a while, you see people who are able to see these connections. I mean, it's you find things that look odd at the beginning. I mean, Cormac McCarthy, who died recently, famous writer, decided that he wanted to live among people who did physics and math, and he set shop. He moved to the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico because he wanted to hear from these other people. And when you look around, you'll find lots of people who are able to do this sort of connections. Some of them are being rediscovered now. There's a fellow that we give some play in the book, Georgi Kepes, famous Hungarian guy. He set foot in MIT and he merged art, math, everything. Even Man Ray was he was connected with some things that Henry Poincaré did in math. So there are these people, and I think it's a huge advantage when you're able to traverse domains. I think the best ideas happen at intersections of domains, and we can go more deeply into this.
You're speaking my language. Yeah, yeah. So for those of us that are listening that maybe aren't artists, maybe they're in a particular domain, maybe they're a great mechanical engineer, or they're great at building something, right? What do you mean by thinking visually?
So let me kind of step back a little bit and see if this explains it. And some people have written about this. I quote a fellow named Gerald Holton, who is a historian of science at Harvard, actually started in physics. And he talks about the role of visual imagination. And the point is that at some point in the past, in the 1800s, beginning 1900s, images were considered to be aids to the thinking. But when you finish something, even though the image could have been an inspiration, and you were able to prove this fantastic theorem in math, you remove the scaffold and the images were removed from there, and what remained was this pure thing that you know is right, but you may have no idea how that was produced in the first place. And that's something that does a lot of disservice to people trying to understand and learn. Because what we normally educate people is on something that has achieved perfection. Every course in physics and whatever, you explain to people things that are there, they are solid, but we don't explain the struggles that people have in reaching those points. And at the beginning of reaching those points, in many cases, there was some kind of visual metaphor that created the links in the reasoning that eventually led the final result. But the visual part, to me, has to do more with absorbing something more holistically rather than sequentially. And you have to be able to do both. As I said, maybe the inspiration comes from this image, but then when it comes to the point of going sequentially to proving and saying, fine, QED, this is done. Yeah, you need to use the other mode of thinking that is more analytical, sequential, logical, rational, whatever. But the inspiration may have come from something more metaphorical, more holistic, more artistic, if you want. So I think it's important to be able to traverse both, or if not, at the very least, have an appreciation for how the other side thinks. We tend to confuse a lot people with the outcomes of what they do. A great writer with a book, there it is, the book. But knowing how the ideas came into play, even knowing the mode of working, the process is as important as anything else. There is one example here that I have from in my office. I cannot show it to you. One friend of mine gave it to me when I stepped down. The name of this fellow is Dario Robleto. And Dario cares a lot about memories, is one of the things that fascinate him now. And for reasons that only artists can explain to you, he saw that lots of people were discarding memories, that lots of people were getting rid of boxes and boxes of photographs and putting them in eBay and just for pennies. And he observed something in these photographs. But then he put it in larger context. I mean, when I was growing up, and my family you guys are younger, much younger, hired a photographer, took a picture of the family, one picture that was precious. At some point, cameras became more available. At some point, you will drop the rolls to be developed in some place, and you only saw what you got once the picture was developed. And then in what was a millisecond in human scale, we had these digital cameras, and we could take pictures. We couldn't edit them. We can trash them. And now pictures, everybody takes pictures. We can edit, we can morph them, we can do anything. But there was one odd point in this history, and that was the point of Polaroids. And Dario discovered that people had taken Polaroids. You love this, given your interest in music. Polaroids to concerts. It's a bad thing to take to a concert. It's very bulky. People bump into you.
Very disruptive too, right? Yeah.
Yeah. You couldn't zoom, but he found some pictures that people were taking Polaroids in concerts. They were all mistakes. And then he tried to find more, and eventually he went like from 10,000 photographs and he isolated 9 of them. And all of these pictures were pictures that people had taken in a concert. Jimi Hendrix, Nina Simone, Serge Gainsbourg, even Frank Sinatra. And I love this, in an array of 9 images. And there are two things that occur to me looking at this array of pictures, this work from Dario is, now that we are all, and we are going to use, and I have used AI, GPT responds to prompt questions and can be a valuable asset, a valuable sidekick. But what kind of questions could have produced what Dario Robleto did with his 9 array of pictures taken in concerts that were failed experiments? That's something that fascinates me. And this, the first thing that I put in the walls of this new office when I moved was this work from Dario.
Wow.
So it's that serendipitous inspiration which comes from somewhere that AI you can't replicate with a prompt.
No, I mean, the guy who said this, 50% of what you hear as quotes are attributed to the historical persona, but the person didn't say it, okay? And I kind of took pains to make sure that if I put a quote in the book, I said attributed to, like the rational mind is a good servant, but the creative mind is whatever gift. Einstein. Well, he didn't say it, okay? But there is one guy who said this, and I studied it. Did he say it? Did he use this word? And apparently it was an interview, and the quote is, you'll never imagine who said it. Computers are stupid. They only answer questions. That was Pablo
Was that
Picasso.
Picasso? Yeah.
Picasso. Yeah.
Yep.
So I think he had a point in there, okay? But there's no question that our ability to create a wealth of possibilities will, I mean, artists will use it. I mean, artists will use any technology available. At the same time, there are artists there are still people taking pictures with pinhole cameras. It's everything at once. But I think Charles Baudelaire is the one who said that photography is going to means the end of art. Well, we know that didn't happen.
No.
In the same way that recorded music didn't kill music. So how this will evolve, I have no idea. But there's no question that artists will use whatever available technology is there. And in some sense, they are probably ahead in seeing the world that's coming. There's no question that science fiction writers saw the future better than people in science.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just, and to me, something that fascinates me about, for example, German expressionism. If you look at those pictures, you can see World War II coming. Just you see it in there. So the idea that I don't want this to sound like a cliche, but I really believe that our mind, our thinking is enriched when you make an effort to understand how other people in other disciplines think, in other domains. And it's a mistake to confuse the product, the outcome, with the thinking. I think understanding the process that led to that outcome is critical.
So that requires this. That's a great point. I think is like totally applicable to kind of society in general. When you're looking at someone with an opposing viewpoint or an alternate viewpoint, wouldn't you say that to activate that ability requires a a just appreciation or an understanding or a learning to be empathetic or catalyzing empathy as a starting point?
I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it. I mean, when I was in my job as dean, we put at the beginning of the curriculum in here something that I'm very proud of, which is called DTC, Design Thinking and Communication. And you show up fresh from high school, of course, the people who show up in here know that they can expect this. So in design thinking and communication, you are putting a team, it's a team of 4. We curate a little bit of these teams. For example, we'll never put a woman with 3 guys, but it's kind of random. It's like life. Sometimes you will have a good team, a bad team, and this team gets a question. Remember, this is the first week of classes in engineering. And the questions, there's always someone real behind the question. But the question could be, for example, a lot were generated by what was the Institute of Rehabilitation in Chicago. People who have lost some function would go there. It's one of the best in the world. So a problem could be a mother and a 10-year-old child who was born without arms. What's the problem? Or what's the issue that you have to solve, quote unquote? The boy wants to be more independent. He's 10 years old. He has been paid by the mother, done everything for him. He wants to be more independent. The mother also wants the boy to be more independent. So how do you solve this? So you interview the person in question, and each team, there will be multiple teams. They have, by the middle of the course, they have to come up with 3 alternatives in such a way that the client can say, about alternative A, we really like it, but not this component. B, we appreciate the effort, but I don't think it's good for us. But you know what? We like this part of C. So everybody will evolve. So what you learn in this process? You have to learn some empathy. You need to be creative. You need to be resilient, because people are not going to tell you, oh, this is the best idea I have. You need to be able to operate as a part of a team. The course is called Design Thinking and Communications. But in some sense, what you learn in this course, when your mind is at the most plastic, the most flexible, just after you finish high school, they are all lessons in leadership, really. And it's very hard to scale up, because the ratio of instructor is a misnomer. These people don't come and teach, they go and around and ask you questions. Is basically 1 instructor per 8 students. So it's very costly to do. But my dream is that there will be more things like this, in which you really this is life-forming experience. And I'm mentioning this as one teeny little example on how education could really form the minds of people in such a way that they think more as part of teams, they are more empathetic, they are more creative, rather than being completely algorithmic.
Education's a big piece of this, right? Because like the foundations of what you write about in your book and all of your research and your work are pointing towards activating a capability for us as individuals, society as a whole, to start to think about and tackle very big problems, right? We talked about that in kind of the pre-production. But what if, so I get this a lot because, I'm in the creative field as well. Mark is as well. I'm kind of in between a bunch of fields, which is why I'm so interested in this. I get a lot of people always coming to me and saying, I wish I were creative. I just don't have a creative bone in my body. Like what that's a big narrative that you have to like break to get into this mindset. How do you take someone there?
I mean, the one standard answer is, oh, everybody's creative to certain degrees. But I think you can teach creativity. What is very hard to teach, unless you put this in a pair of glasses and you have it there for constantly to be reminded of. What is hard to teach, which is at the root of this, is how to be curious. How to be curious is much harder to teach than how to be creative. Creative thinking, I think, can be taught in some ways. In some senses, working against habits that at some point people acquire, like, oh, I want to solve this and I want a great idea, rather than in 5 minutes, I'm going to put something on paper and I just leave it there. And the idea that you should kind of evolve possible solutions in a very kind of non-linear way. So yeah, there are things that probably are extremely hard to acquire unless you are trained in a very substantial way. I mean, no one suddenly can decide, oh, I want to be a great musician or to write music, and we just the desire to do it when you are 45. But the ability to be more creative has to do with forcing yourself to put things out there that they are all kind of not that good. But the point is, the thing that looks, we all know examples of things that they look good at the beginning, but they had a short run life, and things that they were kind of imperfect at the beginning that evolved in a more even exponential way and became great. And we are always conditioned to think of things that look, they have all the components nearly perfect in there. So I think creativity, and this is for much longer conversation. I get that a lot, that people, oh, I'm not very creative. Maybe you should try to surround yourself with people who are more creative, try to hang around, see how they think about things. That part of that will rub in you.
I think I love that you mention curiosity in the beginning of this, and creativity being curiosity. Would it be a question of not even learning curiosity, but relearning curiosity? I mean, my son is 4 years old. I don't need to be told that curiosity is not the root of creativity, because I see it 700 times a day. And I know the people in the book, all these great people from the past that you mentioned as examples of how to be creative, and then cross-domain creativity, either by happenstance or by design, they've held on somehow to that curiosity of youth.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. There's a great quote from Picasso that it took him so much time in his lifetime to learn how to draw again like a child.
Does the Nexus framework? Can we relearn that by taking the points of your book and then almost kind of rewire the brain into a more simplistic?
That's what I would like to happen. I mean, when you mentioned a child, when you see how a child learns, it's humbling. I mean, if you are in artificial intelligence, it's kind of humbling. I mean, your kid didn't have to see 10,000 pictures of a cat to recognize a cat, okay? And they do not know. I mean, this is a cliche that you have to paint within the lines. No, it's like we are all born with curiosity, largely with curiosity and creativity. And then part of the education kind of kills that in some way. So the question is how to keep the parts that require effort in learning. I mean, there are things that are very hard to learn on your own. I mean, no one learns calculus on your own. It can happen. Many people learn to program on their own, but there are things that require structure, and that's good. I mean, you go to law school to learn what? Is to learn how to think like a lawyer. Okay, that's fine. You need the process, but that process sometimes completely kills the other part. The part that you want to keep alive, the part that has not died in some people, the ones that you were mentioning, Mark. So I think you have to try to be able to put these two pieces together. And yes, the book is almost like a plea to try to be able to do that.
There's a big piece of all of this that resonates personally with me. I've done a lot of research, and I teach a writing program at Emory University in Atlanta called Write to Know You, and it's using writing as a self-discovery tool, right? And what I learned in a personal experiment that I did for a year is that activating curiosity gives you a fuel tank to chase anything down. It doesn't feel like you're treading. It doesn't feel like you're trying to do it, right? But then there's also that you hit curiosity, but you also hit the idea of vulnerability. I think when you start pushing these works in progress out to a bigger group of people, I think that's how creativity can be activated and turned into a cycle. But let's talk about divergent thinking a little bit,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
there's a study that you've probably read back years ago in the 60s that had to do with NASA and the fact that divergent thinking capability was halved every 5 years, and most adults are 2% capable of thinking divergently, right? So how do we? I guess that's part of what you answered in Mark's question, but that's a pretty big challenge, right, to get people on board with that.
yeah. I mean, maybe they did a study recently in Wharton in UPenn about the ability to come up with creative possibilities, and they tested the MBAs with GPT, and they discovered that GPT was really a significant help in that. That was one study. The other one that you may have heard is Boston Consulting, which AI assisted consultants perform better. So maybe the idea that AI can help you with divergent thinking, and maybe that's not a far-fetched idea. Um, but yeah, the idea that you shouldn't converge, I mean, this is at a higher level, converge too quickly into one possible solution and discarding externalities that make the problem more complex. At some point, you will be able to have something that, yeah, this looks like I can solve it. I have all these tools to solve this. But you discard it so much in the process that you are solving something that has ceased to be the problem that has to be solved. So the idea of having divergent thinking, all sort of floating in there before you descend into the, okay, this is what we will do, I think is essential.
That's a big
The
theme.
problem,
It's a big theme that you talk about in the book too. This the importance of creativity, but also the importance of execution, right? Because
yeah,
if you could just creative and all these great things are floating in the air and you haven't pulled one down and done
yeah,
anything with it,
yeah,
how do people balance that? That's pretty tricky, right?
yeah. The other thing that also happens when you have all of this array of ideas, and I think it's something that I think is important, is that you may find two things that are diametrically opposed to each other. And I think I quote Scott Fitzgerald in the book that the ability to hold two opposing ideas and still function is a mark of genius. The problem is that most of us, when faced with things that kind of oppose each other, we try to take one camp. And so when you have lots of people who are really good in execution, uh, and this is the balance that you have to have. You want a wealth of ideas, and if you have teams that are really creative, you'll have lots of ideas, but probably you have that many people who can execute within the team. You'll never converge. But if you want the ideas to become real, you want some of these people who are able to converge and make the ideas real. And one example that I put in the book is one of my colleagues is the example of Broadway shows in which you have these teams of maybe 5, 6 people. Some people are on the creative side, the choreographer, the librettist, whatever. But then you have the producer. The producer is the guy who wants to, well, we invested this amount of money, this has to happen. And then the director has to be kind of maybe the Nexus thinker in the group, trying to balance the creativity and the execution in there. But yeah, so you need both things. You need creative solutions to expand thinking spaces, but you need those ideas to become real. And that's why in the book we push so much the idea of operating in a complex world and try to understand that there are many things that should be part of our education. The idea of emergence, complexity, thinking in terms of networks, thinking in terms of small effects can produce huge outcomes. All of these, my dream is that those things will become more prevalent in the way that we educate people. It's very, yeah.
Yeah, I was just hinting on the complex systems. I want to make, because you explained this very well. What is the difference between complex and complicated?
Okay, so a jetliner has hundreds of thousands of parts, okay? Where each of those parts is and where will they be in the final design is something that is all encoded in a blueprint, okay? Each part has a function, that function is fixed. If you don't want to have the risk of the whole thing going down, you will have a backup for that part, but that part cannot look at the system itself and say, wow, this is failing, so I better change my function to this something else. So a complicated system is a system in which there are multiple parts, they are all linked in specific ways, they have all created with a master design, and there's no opportunity for adaptation, really. A complex system, on the other hand, is a system in which there are multiple parts, they interact with each other in some ways that could be clear or less clear, but the way that the system evolves is something that is not encoded directly by looking at the parts. I mean, you can study a fish to death and not be able to imagine how fish will operate when they form schools. We have seen flocks of birds in the same way. So ecologies, for example, are complex systems. Within limits, they can adapt. Biological systems are complex systems. In fact, you have parts that could evolve into have different functions, like stem cells. Complex systems are systems like an airplane, a car, all systems that have been engineered. Now, there are things in between. We design every part of the web, but no one designed the whole. In the same way that we design every component that forms the internet, but no one designed the whole thing at once. So the internet is always failing, and it always manages to kind of, I mean, one of my biggest surprises during the pandemic was that the internet kept functioning. So it's able to adapt in some way. Now, it could well be, and we are getting close to this, that some engineered systems, like a car now you buy a car and the car tells you, check on this part is not functioning well, you better check it, go to the dealer or whatever. If you were to sort of put more AI in engineered systems, maybe there is the possibility that some of those functions could evolve into other functions. And so these systems will become sort of intermediate between complicated and complex. It will become more like sort of biological system in between.
I want to switch that on its head, and I think you may have answered it. I'm not sure. I think we're all familiar with the idea of the idea, not of actually doing it, but of finding simplicity in complexity. Like the idea of that. But you mentioned finding complexity in the simple, and I'm like, that's really fascinating for me, because how should we think about that? Like, what do you actually mean by finding complexity in the simple? Is that kind of what you've just said about birds and the fractals?
Well, no, I think the example that I put in the book, and there are several like this. You know, the famous paper of James Watson and Francis Crick, the one that 900 words long, the one that gave them the Nobel Prize with Watkins, Nobel Prize can go only to 3 people. The 3 got it, and Rosalind Franklin was left out in there. Well, the last sentence of the paper that sort of discovered the structure of the DNA and the ability to things make copies of themselves. The last sentence of the paper was, it has not escaped our attention, I'm paraphrasing it here, that the structure proposed could have interesting biological consequences. Well, if you start thinking about it, the ability, what they discovered with the DNA structure is like the beginning, the very beginning of everything that became biotech. And everything emerges from that simple idea. However, that will be impossible for anybody that with that idea, you could see all the consequences. The same way that when people developed the first transistor, you would never have imagined the wealth of things that were formed with that idea. But in some cases, you can see it. You can see, I don't want to use the example of Uber, for example. Once you have the idea that there are lots of people there that could be driving for us, you could imagine what consequences the ideas would have. And in many cases, you hit on that sort of nucleus, that idea, and you can imagine the consequences that idea will have and grow. And in some sense, most of physics at the very root is you are able to distill lots of messy things that they look like have no unity into one component, and that component, when expanded, can capture all of those things. The ability of going from complex to simple, I think, is what is the essence of capturing theory, the theory of something. But once you have that, is what can these things be good for? And there are people who are, I'm sure you know examples of people who are really good doing one thing or the other one. If you can manage or be surrounded, I mean, everything that we talk about Nexus, thinkers, applies to teams, okay? You can have the perfect Nexus team. And again, you can have, especially in music, you can give me example. Writing now is more solitary activity, but the ability to complement yourself with people who may have a crucial capability that you don't have. And then you have this sequence of divergence, convergence, ideas, execution. I think that at the end, that's probably what the book is trying to advocate.
I love that. I also love the idea of Watson and Crick getting the Nobel for 900 words on the construction of DNA and life, and then people write 1,000 words on stupid, meaningless things, and you can actually get such great ideas into such short space. Love it.
Yeah, to me, that where you were going, Julio, on that thread, the idea of something simple extending into complexity. There was a great little piece in the back of the book about Star Wars that talks about Star Wars, the film, and what it had in the extensions and effects. Films aren't simple, but when you look at a film in what it did, it changes in how sound is captured, how technology is used. Industrial light and magic, Skywalker sound turns into video games, turns into world. I mean, that was a brilliant example of that.
But there is one example that I put in there about complex systems that captures a lot of what we're trying to discuss in here. And I remember going around, and when I was trying to assemble people for this center of complexity, I'm talking with who was then a colleague of mine. And he said, have you seen, the colleague of mine was Roger Myers, who was a professor in economics here. You should read this book by this guy, Thomas Schelling, called From Micro Motives to Macro Behavior. And as soon as he gave me the title, by the way, Roger Myerson went on to win the Nobel Prize of Economics. He was in Northwestern, moved to Chicago. So what Schelling was doing this was in 1978. Computers were far less advanced than now. He imagined this completely baby toy example of a city, which was like a grid, like in a chessboard. And in this chessboard, he will have two classes of inhabitants. Let's say red inhabitants and green inhabitants. And let's say they were half and half. They didn't occupy every piece of the board because he wanted them to be able to move. So they will be, let's say, 40-40 and then 20% empty. And he said, I'm going to make these people have different degrees of tolerance. Let's say that they're half tolerant. And by that he meant that if you are a green inhabitant and in this grid in there, your neighbors were only half green, you will be happy. But if your neighbors were less than half green, you will move. So he did this. Looks like so simple. And you can put it, by the way, you can run this in a computer in a millisecond now. And you can have different degrees of tolerance. In this case, let's say half. And you say, give me an arrangement that makes everybody happy. And the surprise is that this sort of toy city becomes really segregated. So from understanding 50% happy to the outcome that it produced, that was a surprise. And it works the other way around. If I show you that this is segregated in this way, could you tell me how the individuals were? And you'll never discover that they were half tolerant. So this is something at the essence of these complexity things. If I give you the behavior of the units that comprise the complex system, you may not be able to predict what the system will do in this emergent behavior, and vice versa. You see the emergent behavior and you try to deduce the root causes, you may not be able to do it as well. So that's, I think, is a pretty significant lesson. But it's not something that gets consumed in most courses when you are studying, let's say, engineering, for example, because it doesn't really lead to a practical application per se, but it really allows you to think more clearly. It's a window on how two other problems may behave.
Isn't that a thing about not having a practical or instant solution or application kind of stops the thinking because people want something immediate and practical? Like just speaking of like immediate and practical, and I'm aware of time here. A lot of the people listening to this, perhaps they are new to a project, they're brought into a project, they have to very quickly find out what the problems are and what the challenges are. And something that you said earlier, Julia, was about solving the right challenge. How do you, if you're thrown into the midst of something, use this way of thinking to find out if you are indeed solving the right problem?
I think that I think that listening to having a team where we involve people with different viewpoints is essential, because everybody will try to extract what they think is the essence of the problem based on the thing that they have implanted in their brains that has to do with the education that they had. I mean, one thing that I mentioned, probably I should have mentioned this more prominently in the book, is this. I mean, we go through life constructing a mental library in our brains. And at some point in our life, especially when you are formally educated, there are big additions to that library. You have all of these little volumes somewhere housed there in your brain. I mentioned in the past, you go to law school, how to think like a lawyer. All of those volumes are there organized. If you're an anthropologist, you have another way of looking at things. And whatever library you have in your brain is what gives you a lens through which you see the world. The question is that that lens may not be sufficient to capture the complexity of the problem that you have in front of you. In fact, for some people, that library is so well organized that when an idea comes, if you cannot really file it instantly where this new book in my library of knowledge should be filed, you discard it. You don't just leave it in there in the collection or in a holding place of ideas to be considered at a later date. You just put it in there or discard it. So the whole thing in seeing a complex problem in its totality is to benefit from the lenses that diverse people will bring into the issue. Most of the problems that we face now, and I mean, we mentioned in passing climate, biodiversity, food, water, all of those things require more than one lens, require multiple lenses. Someone has to assemble the picture. They rarely would admit a clean, nice solution. Oh, the solution to all of this is wind energy. Well, it's more complicated than that. So the idea is we need to be augmented in our thinking by bringing people who think differently than us. Now, not everybody will be like this, but you want to have enough people within teams that can be able to be the connective tissue of the different thinking components of the team in such a way that what emerges as the solution of the problem is kind of more holistic. It's not like you have sort of discarded externalities and have something nice and clean that you can solve, but is in essence a wrong thing.
I think it's brilliant. I think the idea of this book, and again, it's called the Nexus, and the idea that we can through it, or you can through this hopefully enable new Nexus style thinkers, right? That could assimilate themselves into these great teams. Not everyone has to be a Nexus thinker. It would be great if everyone was, but if we got 10% of the population into that mode, that could be the connective tissue between people that are very focused on a particular discipline and to weave inside and out. Julio, this was fascinating. I literally could continue for another 6 hours on. I have so many other questions, but we'll do a bunch.
You are my ideal readers. Okay. Yeah, but thank you for the opportunity. Really.
This has been amazing. And we'll post a bunch of links and some write-ups to where people can find you and dig more into this. I think it's a super important topic. I think not just as developing people's creativity and activating curiosity and pointing them into interesting modes of discovery, but like the world as it sits today, and we're not going to go into the politics or society of all that, but there's some big problems that need solving, and we need people that can solve them. So thank you for the work that you do and inspiring everybody to hopefully get there. Mark, closing thoughts on your side?
Well, it's just good to know, in fact, that we were speaking about climate change, which is perhaps one of the most pressing, complex challenges facing us. And it's good to know that Julio and Bruce, the co-author of this book, are involved somehow in kind of shaping the thoughts which are going to solve one of the greatest challenges there is. So that's good to know. And I'm with Jeremy. Obviously, yeah, we could ask a million questions about this, but we'll try and get more people to read the book. So we'll do write-ups, we'll post about this and in the next few days and try to get more Nexus thinkers.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy and Mark. Really appreciated the opportunity. I'm really passionate about this, but if there is one final thought, I use art, technology, and science as three big domains of creative thinking accumulated by humanity. And technology is always in between those two. That's technology borrows from science and borrows from art. It's a great space to be if one can manage to sort of navigate some of these intersections. They are great opportunities and is a route to solve some of the biggest problems that we face. Thank you again.
100% agree. What a great closing thought. Another
Yeah.
quick shout out to our sponsor, Ripple, WRIPPLE, Marketing's on-demand talent platform. And hey, guess what? Speaking of Nexus thinkers, so they have something new coming out that they're getting ready to launch that is very similar to a team. We talked about teams, and we talked about someone sitting in the middle of multiple disciplines and organizing that team in a great way. Sometimes it's hard to do when you're on your own, and you can lean on those guys to do it. So check them out, WRIPPLE.com. We are at thinkingonpaper.xyz. We are now syndicated on all podcast platforms. YouTube, you can see all previous episodes, but we have a ton of fun stuff coming up in what we're calling season 2 after the first of the year. We're getting ready to wrap season 1 in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much for listening and inspiring us to find great guests like Julio. Have a great day.
Thank you.
See you next week.